Welcome to Kimsey Software's MetalTrax training series. This is video 4, Setting Up MetalTrax. Vendors by Kyle Kimsey.
This is the fourth video in the MetalTrax training series, video 4, Setting Up and Creating Vendors. I click on the Accounts Payable button. Come down, there's a vendor under Master Files, Vendors. I click on Vendors, and I get the following screen. I don't have any vendors set up. As if I do a lookup there or binocular, you're going to see it says no vendors have been defined. At this point, I click on the New button. You can type in a vendor ID that can be a numeric or it can be alphanumeric, or you can have the system assign it. In this session, I will be doing two vendors. The first vendor I'm going to set up is Metal Man. So I could do Metal and I could do Man, or I could do Metal M001 or whatever I want. In this case, I'll do it so it's a little intuitive. Metal Man. The name is going to be Metal Man Products. And the lookup description, I don't need to put anything here. It's not required. If you have a lot of the same vendors that have similar names and you need to put a lookup description to make it so it's a little bit more easy to find, you may have like a Smith or a Jones. If you have a lot of Jones vendors, you could have one that says the lookup description, maybe the city that they're found in, or maybe a phone number. At this point, we're going to go down to vendor type and vendor group. I'm not going to put anything in vendor type or vendor group at this time, but we will explain that later on in the video. The default GL account. This is if you're going to be doing, if you're having a, let's say a vendor that is a utilities vendor, this would be the offset account for any manual invoice. So when you enter in a manual invoice, which we'll see in a later video, it will know to credit the accounts payable, and this would be the account it would debit. So if you were setting up a utilities vendor, you may have that default GL account being your utilities expense account. If you were setting up a freight vendor, it may be a freight expense account. In this case, this is a material vendor, so I don't need anything in the default GL accounts. Account number is their account number, and so this isn't one that is the account number that you're generating for MetalTrax, but maybe their account number that they're giving you, that maybe they have an account number that is something that they give you. You can track that. Right over here, the inactive vendor, if you click on that, that means you're no longer buying from that vendor, and then it won't show up on the reports or lookups. This secure vendor, an intercompany vendor, you don't need to enter that now either. We can talk about that later. These right here, for if you're doing a 1099, you could click on this and put in the federal tax ID and the social security number. At this time, we're not going to, however, we're just going to put in a credit limit of $100,000. Remember, again, the credit limit is not required. Anything that does not have a black label like this is not actually required. If you do want to track with the vendor the lead time, the typical lead time for the vendor, or a minimum container weight, you can put those in here. You can also track SIC codes for this vendor and manufacturing methods. For now, we're going to come down. We're going to say it's a net credit terms. We're going to give this as a 5% discount, 10 days, net 30. When you do that in the forms description, this is where you would type what would print on the form for like the purchase orders and other documents that are going to the vendor. And so you'd want to say for the terms would be 0.5%, 10 days, net 30. Any comments, or just the comments that you'll want to appear on the vendor? Maybe you have comments about how the vendor wants things shipped. You can put it on here. But those typically would go more on the purchase order line or canned comment notes, what we'll talk about later. At this point, we're going to put in an address. I have pickup, remit to, sales, and physical and mailing. So metal products, if I want to put 456 East Franklin Boulevard, and maybe that's in 90216. And if I type that in, I did this to show you that I've either, two things, I've either entered the wrong zip code there, or the zip code is not in the national database for zip codes. You can add it here, but chances are most of the time when you type in this zip code, if it's not a zip code with a dash, you probably entered it in wrong. So I look and I said, oh, I did. I meant to put, and oh, this is in Beverly Hills, and you can type in the correct zip code. The contact is your contact at the vendor. So let's say my pickup contact there is Mike Green, and I can put in any phone numbers, or I do not need to put in phone numbers. They're not required, but I can. The remit to address, if it's a different address, you can type it in. If it's not, you can set it to the pickup address. In this case, you can change it. So if I change it here, and this is 1000 Bell Road, and maybe that is in a different area, a different zip code. If I typed it in, you notice it's still Beverly Hills, but the zip code also recognizes that as Beverly Hills. The attention, if I just put in attention here, I can put a name, or if I can just say accounts receivable, and that will print on the documents as attention to accounts receivable. For their invoices, it would print and say, for their documents, it would print and say remit to accounts receivable. Attention accounts receivable, remit to address would have attention accounts receivable. Sales and physical addresses can also be set. If you wanted to change them, you can click on them and change the address. If I wanted, 210 because I'd done the address wrong originally, I'd also want to make sure if I set it to the physical address, I can just click on set to physical and it'll set it. When you save, you can click on the save button and you can close down the window. Remember, we set the escape up in the other videos, so you can hit escape there as well and close down any of the windows. Contacts are set up quite a bit like the customer contacts. In this case, I'm going to set up a contact that is Sherry. The last name is Vernon. And her title is, she's the CEO. And then I can put in additional address if I want, or just have her as the contact. And I'm going to say primary contact for, let's say she's a primary administration contact. When I'm done, I save. If I want to add a new contact, I click on new. And this time, let's say my contact is John. The last name is Arrington. And John Arrington is the one that I will be calling in. So maybe he's a clerk. You notice I can say primary contact, and then that can be the primary accounts receivable contact. Or maybe it's a primary sales contact. In this case, we'll say primary accounts receivable. If I have a contact that is the primary sales contact, that's the contact that will appear on the purchase order screens as we do some purchase orders later on. I save it, and now I've set up contacts. Notice you can also set up notes. When you start getting this vendor has activity, you can get into vendor activity. That will be in another demo. Now, once we've set up the vendor and saved, the vendor's now out there. If I want to do a lookup in any of the parts of the system throughout MetalTrax, if you just start typing in, so let's say I type in metal or just MET and hit enter, it's going to go out there and grab everything that begins with MET. I can then select it. Now in this case, I'm going to edit. We're going to go here for a minute. You notice it says manufacturing methods. So right here, it gives me different manufacturing methods. Let's say this vendor, Metalman Products, does a lot of seamless work for me, seamless pipe. I can click that in. And then I can do a lookup later on when I'm looking at vendors and say, give me all my seamless vendors. So that's one. So as you notice, as I'm doing a lookup here, I can then say a lookup and say, I want to see all of my seamless vendors. And then as you look through it and display the records, it's going to give you everybody that's a seamless vendor. Now you notice here another one is service. So what service they have. I've set up some services. So I'll show you how that's done. Under vendors, we have vendor services. We have some default services out there that come with the software. That's why I still have them out there. It'll be with your blank version. Burning, cut to lake, cutting, and slitting. So let's say one of my vendors does some slitting for me. I can click on slitting, and I can add, or let's say I want to add, and I can delete that, but let's say I want to add one. When you come in to the vendor screen, when you come into this vendor services, you can click down here, and let's say I want to add one of my vendors does water jet cutting for me. I can say water jet cutting, and I can add that as a service. Now let's go set up a vendor for water jet cutting and see how that works. Now, just as in customers, what I wanted to do is show you how you can set up a vendor ID and just type in an alphanumeric vendor ID. But also you can come into feature initializations, and you can come down to list features containing words or phrases, and I can type in the word if I'm looking for it. To say next, you notice it says auto select next vendor ID. So let's say I want to turn that on, and my next vendor ID is going to be 20,000. Now how that works is if I come back in accounts payable and I'm in my vendor screen and I'm doing a new and I hit enter there, I can still type in a vendor ID if I wanted a new one, but if I hit enter, it will give me that number. Now in this case, let's say our vendor here is Hodson Water Jet Services. Now in this case, I come down, the vendor type, vendor group, I'm going to bypass all of that as I mentioned before. But I'm going to come down here, put in the net 30, and I'm going to put in an address for my vendor. Type in a zip code. Oops, I mistyped a zip code again. I meant to do 84790 St. George. And then I'm going to put in a phone number. And then I'm going to put in a fax. I'm going to say in this case, my remit to address, my sales physical address, and they're all the same. So I'm going to save, close down the window. Now you notice the services button, it is not enabled yet. I'm entering a new vendor, so watch. As I save this, I can then pull up the vendor. So let's start typing in water here. Oh, sorry, I meant Hodson. I was looking up Hodson. I can display, I can see Hodson Water Jet Services. Now you notice now that the vendor's in, I can edit and I can put in a service. So I'm going to say that they're water jet cutting. I just click on the services, but they also do cutting for me. So I'm going to say water jet and cutting. I click OK. Now I've added those services to this vendor. So now when I save, I can save. Let's say now I was looking up for all my water jet vendors. I can do a lookup here, and I can clear it. I can say, all right, I want to say all my vendors that do water jet. Or I can even do water jet and cutting. When I'm done, I just click on display records and it will show me all my vendors that do the services that I'm looking for. So that's how you do lookups on services and manufacturing methods. The next thing we wanted to show you with vendors is things called vendor groups. Now underneath my vendor file, there's something called vendor groups. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to set up a vendor group. I'm going to say new, and I'm going to set up a vendor group 1. It can be any number, 1 through 9,999. But when it says double click to select the vendor to category, you notice there are no categories that are set up. So I can't do a vendor group at this time. And so if you're trying to do that, you'll have to wait till later when we set up vendor groups. But what vendor groups do, vendor groups will allow me to set up vendors where if I'm doing an RFQ on a sales order, I can look up all vendors that belong to that group. So remember this, and we'll cover that a little bit later. So on my vendors, you've now set up your vendors. We will talk about vendor types and groups later on. You've set up your services, and that's setting up a vendor. Any other questions? You can give a tech support person a call, and please feel free to view our other videos. Again, this is MetalTrax video 4, setting up vendors.